I knew something was wrong the Sunday airline watch looked straight through me like we'd never met. 18 years. 18 years of her hugging me at the door of New Hope before I even made it past the welcome mat. The same clothes, talcum and lavender hug every single week. And that morning, she just didn't. She turned half away like she was reaching for her umbrella and walked past me to greet the Pattersons instead. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she didn't see me. Maybe her knee was bothering her again, and she wasn't thinking about hugging anybody. Then Geraldine Holt did the same thing the next week. Then the Simmons sisters, both of them on the same Sunday, within 5 minutes of each other, like they'd agreed on it beforehand. By the third week, I noticed that nobody was agreeing on it beforehand. They didn't have to. Something had already gotten around, and it had gotten around so completely that everybody already knew the part. Nobody had bothered to tell me little things at first. A choir member who used to save me a seat stopped saving me a seat. Stop saving me a seat. A woman I had taught Sunday school with for 9 years started taking me a long way around the fellowship hall just to avoid walking past where I was standing. Then there was the Sunday with the little girl. I won't say her name yet. She came barreling down the side aisle the way she always did, arms already opening for the hug I'd given her every single week for 2 years, and her mother caught her by the shoulder before she ever reached me, turned her gently back around, the kind of turn that's trying very hard to look like nothing at all. Mommy, the little girl said, not even bothering to whisper it, why can't I hug Miss Lorraine anymore? Her mother leaned down and said something into her ear. I was close enough to hear the shape of it without quite hearing the words themselves, low and quick, the particular cadence grown women use when they're trying to end a question instead of answer it. I still didn't understand. That's the part I need you to sit with, because I didn't. Not that Sunday, not for a long time after it. I just stood there in the side aisle with my arm still halfway raised for a hug that wasn't coming, watching a child get walked away from me like I was something a mother had just remembered to be careful around. Nobody explained anything. Nobody said a word out loud. They just got quiet, and they just got cold, and they just got further away, an inch at a time, until I was standing in the middle of a church I had belonged to my whole adult life, and I didn't recognize a single face that would meet mine. I thought losing my grandmother had been the hardest part of that year. I was wrong. My name is Lorraine Brooks, and for a long time, I didn't know why my church had stopped loving me. I was 43 years old that spring, and I had been the principal of Magnolia Elementary for going on 6 years by then. I want to say that because it matters to the kind of person I was before any of this happened. Not somebody flashy, not somebody people whispered about, but somebody parents trusted to walk their 5-year-olds into a building every morning and hand them back safe in the afternoon. I had built a life out of being the reliable one, the one people called when they needed a recommendation letter, or a ride to a doctor's appointment, or somebody steady to sit with them in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. I have been a member of New Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Thomasville for 20 years. Since I was 23 years old and still figuring out who I wanted to be. And in 20 years, I had never once missed a watch night service. I tell you all of that, not to make myself sound like some kind of saint, because I wasn't one. And I don't want you thinking this is a story about a saint. I tell you that because it's the only way you'll understand how strange it felt to lose all of it. The trust, the warmth, all of it, without anybody ever once sitting me down and telling me why. My younger sister is named Vanessa. She is 4 years younger than me, and from the time she was a little girl, she had a way about her that made rooms tilt toward her. People liked being near Vanessa. She laughed loud and easy. She remembered everybody's birthday. She could walk into a room with strangers and leave 45 minutes later with 3 new best friends and somebody's phone number written on a napkin. I used to think it was a kind of magic. I think now it was something closer to a skill, a very practiced, very deliberate skill. But for most of my life, I just thought my sister was simply better at being loved than I was. Our parents, Earl and Dorothy Brooks, never set out to love her more. I want to be fair about that because it would be easy for me to make villains out of 2 people who, in their own way, did the best they understood how to do. But Vanessa was what our mother used to call a lot. She cried louder. She got into more trouble. She needed more managing, more smoothing over, more soft landings after the messes she made. And over 30 years, that need turned into a kind of gravity. Mom and Daddy spent so much of themselves catching Vanessa before she hit the ground that I learned very early not to fall. I don't think I resented it. Not back then. I told myself I was a strong one, and there's a particular kind of pride that comes from believing that about yourself, even when it isn't entirely true, even when some nights you go home to an empty house and wonder who exactly is supposed to catch you. The one person who always seemed to see both of us clearly, really see us. the way you see two different rooms in the same house, was our grandmother. We called her Grandma Ruth, though her name was Ruth Calloway, and she was my mother's mother. She had outlived one husband and buried two of her own children before I was ever born, and by the time I came along, she had the kind of face that looked like it had already decided most of what there was to decide about people and had decided to love them anyway. Grandma Ruth lived 2 streets over from us my whole childhood in a little wood frame house with a tin roof that rang like a bell every time it rained, and that house was where I went whenever home got to be too much. She didn't ask me what was wrong. She'd just put a glass of sweet tea in front of me and let me sit at her kitchen table until I was ready to talk or ready not to, and either way was fine with her. I can still call up the sound of her, even now. The particular creak of her rocking chair, 2 beats and a pause, like it was breathing along with her. The way she said my name, not Lorraine the way everybody else said it, but Lorraine, drawn out just slightly on the second half, like she was savoring it. The smell of her, cashmere bouquet powder, and the faint sweetness of whatever she'd been baking. That seemed to live in the fabric of every chair in that house long after she'd stopped sitting in any of them. Her laugh came from somewhere low in her chest and arrived a half second before she meant it to, like she could never quite get ahead of her own joy. She had underlined things in it in 3 different colors of ink, depending on what decade she'd underlined them in, and tucked inside the back cover, behind the concordance. She kept a folded grocery list from 1980-something that she refused to throw away because, she said, your granddaddy wrote that, and his handwriting's the only thing of his I've got left that isn't in a frame. She kept the Bible on the little table beside her rocking chair, not a fancy one. The cover was cracked white leather, gone the color of an old tube, and the pages were so thin from handling you could practically see your fingers through them when you turned to the book of Psalms. She had carried that Bible to church for 60 years. I can still see her hands on that cover, the knuckles swollen with arthritis by the time I was grown, moving across the leather the way you'd smooth a child's hair. I tell you about that Bible now because it matters more than I understood at the time. Everything that happened to me, every bit of it, runs straight back through that cracked white leather cover, though I had no way of knowing that yet. Looking back now, I think about how many evenings I sat across from that Bible without once opening past its cover. I didn't know yet that it was already keeping something from me. It was a slow kind of decline where you watch somebody you love get a little smaller every visit, a little more tired, a little less interested in the things that used to light her up, until one day the doctor sits you down in a hallway that smells like floor cleaner and tells you, gently, that it's time to start thinking about hospice instead of treatment. I would spend the better part of a year not knowing that, and I think about how differently those months might have gone if I had. Grandma Ruth was 86 when her heart started failing. For real, the spring before everything happened. It wasn't sudden. I was the one who sat in that hallway. I want to say that plainly, because it matters later. I never doubted that part. But somewhere around the 3rd month, her visits got shorter and further apart, and mine got longer and closer together. The way these things tend to sort themselves out in families, not because anybody decides it on purpose, but because somebody has to be the one who's there at 2 a.m. when the oxygen machine starts beeping. And over time, that somebody and I just became the same person. Vanessa was there too. At the beginning, she came to the first 2 appointments. She cried real tears, real ones. I learned to do things I never thought I'd learn. I learned how to change a catheter bag without flinching. I learned the exact number of steps between Grandma Ruth's bed and her bathroom, because counting them out loud seemed to help her balance. I learned which hospice nurse, there was a woman named Denise Whitfield, who I will be grateful to until the day I die, would actually answer her phone after 9 at night if I called scared. I pay for things too, not because anybody asked me to, and not because I wanted credit for it, but because the church had taken up a collection for Grandma's care back in the fall. Pastor Sims announced it from the pulpit one Sunday, said New Hope was going to wrap Sister Ruth Calloway in the arms of this congregation, and people gave generously the way they do, and that fund covered some things. The bigger ones, the hospital bed and a chunk of the in-home aid hours. But there were 100 smaller costs that fund never touched. The co-pays, the specialty pharmacy that didn't take her insurance, new nightgowns when she got too thin for the old ones, gas money driving back and forth 4 or 5 times a week. I kept every single receipt in a manila envelope in my glove compartment, not because I was keeping score, but because that's just who I am. I keep records, I always have. Vanessa visited when she visited, and when she did, she brought flowers, and she brought her good perfume, and she filled the room up with her particular kind of warmth. And Grandma Ruth's face would light up the same way it always had since Vanessa was a little girl walking into a room. I never minded that. I want you to understand that because it would be easy to tell this story and make it sound like I minded. like some old resentment was sitting underneath everything I did, but it wasn't. I loved watching my grandmother's face light up. I just also happened to be the one who knew where the morphine schedule was taped to the inside of the kitchen cabinet. There was one night about 3 weeks before she passed when Grandma Ruth was more alert than she'd been in days. It happened sometimes near the end, the nurses told me. A window opens up, clear and sudden, like the body deciding to give you one more good conversation before it lets go. She had me pull the rocking chair right up next to the bed, and she held my hand with a grip that still surprised me considering how light she'd gotten, like holding a bundle of dry kindling that could still somehow squeeze. You think I don't see what's happening in this family, she said. It wasn't a question. I told her I didn't know what she meant. You do know, she said, and she almost smiled. You've always known. You just don't like saying it out loud because saying it out loud would mean admitting somebody you love has been unfair to you for 30 years, and you'd rather carry the weight than say the word, I didn't argue with her. There wasn't any use arguing with Grandma Ruth when she had that look in her eye. I see you. Lorraine, she said, every single thing you've done, the driving, the money, the nights. I see all of it, and I want you to know. I want you to hear me say it while I can still say it plain. I see it, and it matters, and it is not going unnoticed, no matter what anybody else in this family chooses to notice or not notice. She nodded toward the nightstand, where her Bible was sitting the way it always sat, within arm's reach. Hand me that, she said. I gave it to her. She held it against her chest for a minute, just breathing, and then she said, everything I need to say is going in here. Everything. I've already started. She patted the cover twice, slow. When the time comes, you make sure this goes to Pastor Sims, not to your mother. Not to Vanessa. Pastor Sims, you hear me? He'll know what to do with it. I asked her what she meant by everything I need to say. She just shook her head and told me I'd understand when the time was right, and that some things needed to stay between her and her Bible and the Lord until they didn't anymore. I didn't push her on it. I wish now that I had, but I also understand looking back that she wasn't ready to be pushed, and neither was I. And grief makes you patient about things you'd otherwise demand to know right away. The past 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, with my hand in hers and Nurse Denise standing quietly by the window, giving us privacy that wasn't really privacy, just kindness dressed up as something else. I want to say that because she had a beautiful voice and she sang "It Is Well With My Soul" so purely that half the church was in tears before she finished the first verse. And I sat in the front pew and cried too, because it was beautiful. And because my grandmother was gone, and because grief doesn't leave much room for keeping score about who is doing the most crying the most beautifully. The funeral was at New Hope, of course, packed wall to wall because Grandma Ruth had been a fixture in that sanctuary for 60 years, and everybody who'd ever sat under her in Sunday school or eaten her tea cakes at a church picnic came out to send her off proper. Vanessa sang. Afterwards, somebody had to clean out Grandma Ruth's little house with a tin roof, and somehow, the way it always somehow happens in families, this somebody turned out to be me. Mama said she couldn't bear to do it yet. Vanessa said she'd come help on a Saturday, and then that Saturday became 3 Saturdays, and then it just quietly stopped being mentioned. So I drove over on my own time after work a few evenings a week, and I packed up 60 years of a woman's life into cardboard boxes I bought from the U-Haul place on Route 19. And I cried doing it, alone, more than I cried at the funeral, if I'm being honest, because grief catches you sideways like that. It's never as bad in the crowded room as it is folding somebody's nightgowns by yourself at 9 o'clock at night. I found the Bible on the nightstand right where it always sat. I remember holding it for a long minute, remembering what she'd said about Pastor Sims, and I remember thinking clearly, I need to take this to him. I put the Bible in a box marked Grandma, keep along with her reading glasses and a few photographs, and that folded grocery list from the back cover. And I put that box in the corner of my own garage, and I told myself I'd take care of it once the rest of the state business settled down, once I had a free weekend. Once grief stopped sitting on my chest like a stone every time I tried to think clearly about anything that wasn't strictly necessary that day. I need to do that soon. I didn't do it soon. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. There was estate business too, the formal kind, a small life insurance policy, the house, which Grandma had left to be split 3 ways between Mama, Vanessa, and me, handled through a lawyer named Mr. Coleman who done Grandma's will for her years before. None of that involved the Bible. The Bible wasn't an asset. It was just an old woman's old book. And old books get put in boxes, and boxes get put in garages. And garages are where things wait until somebody remembers them. I didn't know yet how much waiting that particular box was about to do. It was maybe 6 weeks after the funeral that I started noticing the strangeness, though noticing isn't quite the right word, because at first it wasn't a thing you could point to. It was more like a temperature change in a room you've lived in your whole life. You can't always say what's different. You just know something is. The first concrete thing I can put my finger on happened at a Wednesday night Bible study, the small one, maybe 15 of us, that I've been attending for 9 years. I walked in a few minutes late because a parent had kept me at school past 5. And when I sat down in my usual seat, the conversation that had been going strong before I walked in just stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It just thinned out the way a fire thins out when you stop feeding it, until somebody mentioned the weather and everybody seized on the weather like a life raft. I told myself I was imagining things. I am by nature not a paranoid person, and I distrusted my own read on the room enough to talk myself out of it 3 separate times that same week. Looking back now, I think some part of me already knew that rotation wasn't the real word for what was coming. I just wasn't ready yet to call it by its real name. Then I lost my seat on the church's benevolence committee. I'd served on that committee for 11 years. We decided as a group how to allocate the church's assistance fund toward families going through hard times. Utility bills, funeral costs, the occasional rent payment for somebody between jobs. It was unpaid, unglamorous work, the kind nobody fights over, and I'd done it faithfully because Pastor Sens had asked me to do it back when I was 32 years old, and I'd never once considered stepping down. Deacon Ronald Pittman called me on a Thursday evening, and I could hear in the first 3 words of that call that something was wrong. The particular gentleness men get in their voice right before they're about to deliver bad news they didn't choose to deliver. Sister Lorraine, he said, the board's decided to do some rotating on committee assignments this quarter. Fresh faces, you understand. Nothing personal. I asked him plainly if this had anything to do with me specifically, or if it was happening to everybody. There was a pause on the line longer than a simple answer should have required. It's just rotation, he said again, like repeating it made it truer. I let it go. I didn't have proof of anything. And I am not somebody who makes a scene over a feeling, even a strong one. I sat there with the phone still warm against my ear for a while after we'd hung up, listening to my own kitchen, the refrigerator humming, a clock ticking somewhere too loud, the particular silence of a house with nobody else in it. That night I sat at my kitchen table, the same kind of table Grandma Ruth used to sit me down at, and I felt for the first time something I can only describe as fear. Not fear of any one thing, just a low, steady fear that the ground under my feet had quietly become something other than solid. Nobody had bothered to warn me. I remember thinking for the first time in 20 years that maybe I didn't belong in that building anymore. I remember being frightened less by the thought itself than by how reasonable it suddenly felt sitting there at my own kitchen table in my own house, with nothing in front of me but a cooling cup of coffee and a fear I couldn't yet put a single fact to. Vanessa called me that same week, before I'd had the chance to decide whether to say anything to anybody else about any of it. I heard about the committee thing, she said. That's not right. Low. You've been on that committee longer than half of them have even been members. There was exactly the right amount of outrage in her voice, exactly the right amount of warmth. I remember feeling sitting there with the phone warm against my ear, genuinely grateful to have a sister who noticed. I'm praying for you, she told me before she hung up. Are people treating you okay otherwise? I told her I was fine. She said, okay, good, and that was that. We hung up. I didn't tell her about Bible study, about the conversation thinning out the second I walked through the door. I didn't have words for it yet myself. I had no way of knowing that night that the sister asking me so gently whether people were treating me okay already understood, better than anybody else alive, exactly why they weren't, and exactly whose doing that was. I called my mother. Mama, I said, something's going on at church. People acting strange around me and I don't know what I did. There was a silence on the line, not a confused one, a careful one. The kind that comes from somebody choosing their words instead of simply having them. Baby, she finally said, maybe just give everybody some space for a little while. Things will settle. Settle from what? Mama. What is there to settle? I don't know all the details, she said. Neither of us said anything for a second. She probably didn't know all the details. She likely knew enough. I didn't push. I think about that more than almost anything else in this whole story. The moment I had the chance to demand a real answer from my own mother. And instead I said, okay, and I'm sorry, and let her go finish whatever she'd been doing before I called. Some old, worn, smooth part of me had spent 43 years not wanting to be the difficult daughter, the one who made waves, the one who needed managing the way Vanessa had always needed managing. I had built my whole identity on not being that. So when the moment came that demanded I be exactly that just once, I didn't know how. At the time, it came the way water comes into a boat with a slow leak. not flooding, just rising patient, a half inch at a time. Until one Sunday in late spring, I looked around the sanctuary during the offering hymn and realized I was sitting by myself in a pew that used to be too crowded to find a seat in. And nobody had sat down beside me on purpose for 6 weeks running. I still believe somebody would eventually ask me for the truth before they let a silence speak for them instead. Nobody ever did. The isolation didn't arrive all at once after that. I remember exactly which hymn it was. Blessed Assurance, the one we'd sung so often I'd stopped really hearing the words years before, and that morning I heard every single one of them. I remember the light coming through the stained glass on the east wall, the dust drifting through it the way it always did on a sunny morning, slow and unbothered, like the room itself hadn't gotten the news yet about what had happened to me. I remember pressing my own hand flat against the cool wood of the empty space beside me just to feel that it was real, that it was actually empty, that I hadn't simply imagined the whole thing. The consequences came in pieces after that, each one small enough that I could almost talk myself out of noticing it, and large enough altogether that I eventually couldn't. Yolanda Price, who I taught alongside in vacation Bible school for 6 summers running, asked Pastor Sims very quietly whether somebody else might teach the children's Sunday school class that quarter instead of me. She didn't say why. She didn't have to say why. Not to him, not by then. He told me about it gently weeks later. The way you tell somebody something you wish you didn't have to tell them. And I remember standing in his office, not understanding at first what exactly I'd done to make a room full of 6-year-olds suddenly unsafe in my care. A woman named Carla Dunmore, whose daughter had been a student at Magnolia Elementary since kindergarten, pulled the girl out in the middle of the spring semester and enrolled her at a school 2 districts over. The transfer paperwork didn't say why. Transfer paperwork never does. But I heard through the same quiet channel everything traveled through by then that Carla had told another mother she just didn't feel right anymore with me running things. I had walked that child into her very first day of kindergarten myself. I had known her favorite color. I didn't know, watching the front office secretary clear out her old cubby on a Tuesday morning, that I would spend the rest of that year wondering how many other parents were having that same quiet conversation about me and simply choosing not to tell anyone. Patricia Ames, who I'd had lunch with every other Tuesday for nearly a decade, the kind of standing lunch you stop even thinking to confirm because it's simply part of the rhythm of your week, texted me one Monday night to say something had come up and she'd have to take a rain check. There was no rain check after that. Pastor Sims stopped calling on me to pray during testimony service, something he'd done 2 or 3 times a month for as long as I could remember. I started calling on other names instead, names that hadn't changed in 18 years but suddenly felt like they had, because mine had quietly come off whatever list lived at his head of voices the congregation trusted to carry their prayers. There was no text after that one either. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time that night, rereading those 11 words, trying to find some version of them that didn't mean what I already knew they meant. Women stopped sitting beside me one at a time until I noticed I was always the first one in a pew and always somehow the only one in it. Conversations got quieter when I walked toward them. Not silent, just quieter. The particular hush of people deciding, without discussing it, that whatever they'd been saying wasn't meant for my ears, even when, as far as I knew, it had never once actually been about me before. The smallest moments were somehow the ones that stayed with me longest. A woman I'd known since Sunday school moved her purse off the empty seat beside her at choir rehearsal, not even looking up. The way you'd move a coat instead of a person. I saw Geraldine Holt switch checkout lines at the grocery store one Saturday, abandoning a half-full cart in the express lane just to put 3 more feet of distance between us at the register. A friend I'd known for 15 years waved warmly, brightly at somebody standing just behind my left shoulder, and it took me a full second to understand the wave had never been for me at all. A woman who'd sat 2 rows behind me for as long as I could remember simply wasn't there one Sunday. And then she wasn't there the Sunday after that either. And I found out later the unkind way that she'd asked the usher to move her family to the other sanctuary. None of it would have meant anything on its own. Anybody could explain away a moved purse, a switched line, a wave that landed somewhere else. It was only once you added enough of them together that you could finally see the shape of what they actually were. Zanessa hugged me at the door the very next Sunday after the committee call. The same easy hug she'd always given me. Lavender and warm, and she held on a beat longer than usual, the kind of beat that's meant to be noticed by whoever happens to be standing close enough to see it. "How are you holding up?" she asked, pitched just loud enough for Earline Watts to hear it 3 feet away. I told her I was fine. She squeezed my arm and told me again that she was praying for me, and afterward, in the fellowship hall, I heard her say to a cluster of women I didn't know well enough to name, "I'm just so worried about my sister lately," in a voice pitched exactly halfway between a confession and a performance. I didn't understand that morning that I was watching her build something. I understood it only much later, that every one of those small public moments of concern had been doing two things at once: making her look like the kind of sister who worries, and making me look very quietly like exactly the kind of person a sister might need to worry about. Every one of those things was small enough on its own to explain away a scheduling conflict, a rotation, a coincidence. But I want you to understand what it does to a person having pieces of your own life quietly removed from you one at a time with no explanation attached to any single piece, because that is the particular cruelty of it. A person can survive losing something all at once. It is much harder to survive losing it a sliver at a time, never knowing, from one week to the next, which small, ordinary thing you have always taken for granted is about to be the next thing taken. A little girl named Chisha, maybe 7 years old, who used to run up and hug my legs every single Sunday because I'd been the one who walked her into kindergarten her very first day of school. I watched her mother gently redirect her one Sunday, turning the child's small shoulders away from me with a hand that was trying so hard to look casual that it wasn't casual at all. Keisha looked confused. She would back at me once over her shoulder, like she was trying to understand what she'd done wrong. And I wanted to tell her, "Baby, you didn't do anything. None of this is about you." But I didn't have the words to explain it to a 7-year-old when I didn't have the words to explain it to myself. There was a week sometime around then when I seriously considered leaving New Hope for good. I want to tell you how much that thought cost me, because I don't think you can understand the rest of this story without understanding that cost. I had been baptized in that sanctuary's font as a grown woman of 23. I had sung in that choir loft. I had buried my grandmother from that very pulpit not 6 months before. New Hope wasn't a building I attended. It was a room I had built half of my adult identity inside of, and sitting in my car in the parking lot one Sunday morning, unable to make myself go in. I understood clearly for the first time that I might actually have to grieve it the same way I had grieved Grandma Ruth, as something I had loved completely and was now, for reasons nobody would explain to me, in the process of losing anyway. I didn't leave. I want to tell you it was some great act of courage that kept me there. And maybe some small piece of it was, but mostly it was simpler and sadder than that. I didn't know yet what I was actually being accused of. I was in the church kitchen, of all places, helping set up for a repast after a funeral. Not grandma's. Somebody else's, an elderly deacon named Brother Hollis who passed the week before, because old habits don't disappear just because a room has gotten cold toward you. And I still believed, on some stubborn level, that showing up and doing the work would eventually thaw things back out, and some stubborn part of me refused to let a room full of people I couldn't even name run me out of the only church home I'd ever had over a reason I hadn't been given the dignity of hearing. I would find out soon enough. It was a Tuesday afternoon in June, almost 5 months after Grandma Ruth passed, when I finally understood. The kitchen smelled the way it always smelled on repast days, coffee going in the big iron, somebody's fried chicken warming low in the oven, the particular sweetness of a sheet cake still under its plastic wrap. It was a smell I had loved my whole life, comfort and grief mixed together in a way only church kitchens managed to get right. I didn't know, breathing it in that afternoon, that I would never be able to smell it again afterward without my stomach turning. Just a little, no matter how many years passed. I was in the pantry on my knees looking for the good tablecloths in the bottom cabinet when I heard two voices on the other side of the half wall that separated the pantry from the kitchen proper. I recognized both voices immediately. Geraldine Holt and a woman named Pauline Easter. Both of them women I'd known for the better part of 2 decades. Both of them women whose children I had personally walked through the doors of Magnolia Elementary on their very first day of kindergarten. Still can't believe it after everything that family did for her. Pauline was saying, "I know it," Geraldine said, "and to take it right out of a dying woman's care fund. Lord, you'd never know it to look at her. Sweet as pie every Sunday." That's exactly how the worst ones are, though. Always have been. I would never trust a woman who could stand up smiling in church every single week after doing something like that to her own dying grandmother. Some people just know how to fake it. They learn it young. How much was it, you think? I heard different numbers. I heard it was thousands. Thousands. Pauline. While that poor woman was laying there sick, dying, and her own granddaughter is skimming off the top of the very money this church raised to take care of her. Imagine standing up in that choir robe every Sunday with that on your conscience. I always thought there was something a little too smooth about her. Too perfect. That's exactly it. Too perfect. The good ones never have to try that hard to look good. I wouldn't trust a woman like that around my own grandchildren, if I'm being honest. Imagine pretending to be such a good Christian all those years. Some people spend years fooling everybody, decades even. I want to tell you, I made some sound that I dropped something that the moment had some dramatic shape to it. It didn't. I just knelt there on that cold kitchen floor with a stack of folded tablecloths in my lap, and I stopped breathing, actually stopped. The way you do sometimes when your body understands something half a second before your mind catches up and gives it words. They were talking about me. I sat with that knowledge the way you sit with the burn before the pain fully arrives, and that strange flat second where you already know something terrible has happened to you and your body just hasn't caught up to telling you how much it's going to hurt. And then it arrived all at once, and it was so much worse than anything I'd let myself imagine in 5 months of wondering. It wasn't only the accusation, it was the certainty in their voices. Pauline hadn't said I heard a rumor. She'd said it the way you say a fact you've already filed away and built other facts on top of. Geraldine hadn't paused before calling me one of the worst ones. She'd said it the way you describe something you finished deciding on a long time ago. I understood, kneeling there, that this had stopped being gossip a long time before that afternoon, weeks ago, maybe months, and had quietly become something else entirely. It had become who I was now, inside that building, inside those women's heads, inside the heads of everyone those women had ever spoken to since. Gossip is a story people tell about you that they know might not be true. This wasn't that anymore. This was simply, calmly, who Lorraine Brooks was understood to be. A woman too smooth to be trusted. A woman who could fake kindness well enough to fool the whole congregation for 18 years. I sat there on that floor and understood that I wasn't fighting a rumor anymore. I was fighting an identity that had already finished forming around me while I've been standing right in the middle of it, smiling at people, helping set their tables, completely unaware that the ground had already closed clean over my head. I stayed kneeling there longer than I needed to, the tablecloths gone slack in my lap, because some part of me understood that once I stood back up, I would be standing up as a different person than the one who had knelt down, and I wasn't ready yet to find out who that person was. It wasn't only the shock of it, though God knows that was bad enough. A clean, cold shock, like stepping into water you thought would be warm. It was the math of it. 5 months. 5 months of looks and silences and a little girl's shoulders turned away from me. The entire time, every single person who'd looked through me or past me or around me had been carrying around this specific, terrible, false idea of who I was. Not one of them, in 5 whole months, had thought enough of our years together to simply ask me if it was true. Nobody ever asked me. I sat there until the voices moved onto something else, some other piece of gossip, life going on around me the way it does, oblivious to the fact that it had just rearranged everything I understood about my own life. And then I stood up and I folded those tablecloths the rest of the way and I carried them out to the fellowship hall and I helped set the tables for Brother Hollis's repast like nothing in the world had happened because I genuinely did not yet know what else a person was supposed to do with information like that. Looking back now, I think that walk from the pantry to the fellowship hall, carrying somebody else's tablecloths with my own reputation lying in pieces behind me, was the loneliest walk I've ever taken in my life. And not a single soul in that building had any idea I was taking it. I don't remember most of the drive home. I remember stopping at a red light on Crawford Street and realizing I've been staring at the same signal long enough for it to turn green twice, cars piling up behind me, somebody finally tapping their horn. Gentle, almost apologetic, the way people honk when they can tell something's wrong with the driver and not just the traffic. I drove the rest of the way with both hands tight on the wheel, my knuckles aching by the time I pulled into my own driveway, though I couldn't have told you right then that I'd been gripping it that hard. I sat there in the car for the better part of an hour before I could make myself go inside. I went back in my mind over every single person who had known the real details of Grandma Ruth's care fund, who had paid for what the church's collection had actually covered, what it hadn't, where the gaps were, and who had quietly filled them. There weren't many people on that list. There was Mr. Coleman, the lawyer, who wouldn't have had any reason in the world to gossip about it. There was Nurse Denise, who I trust with my own life. There was Pastor Sims, who'd announced the fund from the pulpit, but never once asked me for an accounting of every dollar, because he trusted me the way the whole church had always trusted me, right up until apparently they hadn't anymore. And there was Vanessa. I didn't want it to be her. I spent a long time in that driveway trying to construct some other explanation, some version of events when my sister wasn't the person who'd taken 18 years of church family and turned every single one of them against me with what must have been one single well-placed lie repeated to the right 2 or 3 women who could be trusted to do the rest of the spreading on their own. I tried to imagine Mr. Coleman gossiping. I tried to imagine Nurse Denise doing it. Neither one of those pictures would hold together in my head for longer than a few seconds before it fell apart. Because neither one of those people had any reason to lie, and only one person in my life had ever needed her whole life for people to look at her and not look too closely at me. I remembered something that, a small thing, the common thing you don't think twice about when it happens and can't stop thinking about once you understand what it actually was. About 4 months before Grandma passed, Vanessa had asked me, almost casually, over coffee, exactly how much the church's care fund had brought in and exactly how much of it I'd already spent. I told her because why wouldn't I? Because she was my sister and Grandma Ruth's care was something we were supposedly doing together. I sat in a driveway and understood, slowly and completely, the way you understand cold water after you've already been standing in it a while, that my sister had taken the truth of what I'd spent and quietly inverted it into something else entirely and handed that inversion to exactly the right 2 or 3 mouths in our church, and then simply stepped back and let 18 years of trust do the work for her while she sat in the front pew every single Sunday looking exactly as innocent and exactly as beloved as she always had. She'd nodded, written nothing down, said something about wanting to make sure everything was accounted for, and I thought at the time, wasn't that thoughtful of her? I didn't cry. I think people expect crying at a moment like that. I didn't do it. I just sat very still in my car for a long time. And somewhere in that stillness, something in me that had spent 43 years trying not to be difficult, finally, quietly decided I was done being quiet about the truth, even if I still had no intention of being loud about it. Vanessa called again that same week before I'd even decided what to do with what I now knew. I sat there on the other end of that call, already holding Mr. Coleman's copies of the fund disbursements in a folder on my kitchen table, and I listened to my own sister ask me, in a voice that sounded exactly like genuine tenderness, whether I was doing okay. And I understood in a way that turned my stomach in a new direction entirely, that she could do that. You've seemed kind of distant lately, she said. Is everything okay? You know, you can talk to me about anything, right? She could ask. She could sound exactly like a woman who loved me, because in her own way, I still believe she did. I don't know, even now, whether some small part of her believed her own concern while she was saying it. I think that might be the most frightening thing about her, more frightening than the lie itself. She never once had to pretend hard. It came out of her as easily as anything true would have. I didn't confront anybody. The instinct, when you finally understand you've been wronged this badly, is to imagine some big dramatic scene where you finally say everything you've been holding in. That's not what I did. I don't think it's what Grandma Ruth would have wanted me to do either. What I did instead was go quiet in a different way than the quiet that had been forced on me. This was a quiet I chose. I went to see Mr. Coleman first, the lawyer who'd handled Grandma's small estate, mostly because I needed to confirm on paper the exact figures of what the church fund had taken in and what portion of Grandma's actual expenses it had covered. He pulled the file without much trouble. None of it was secret. It had simply never occurred to anybody to ask for it before, and he made me copies of everything. The funds total, the disbursements, the dates, black and white. No room left in it for anybody's version of events but the truth. I went to see Nurse Denise next, on her lunch break in the parking lot of the home help agency she still worked for. I told her what had happened, all of it, and I watched her face go through something close to what mine must have looked like in that car. She didn't hesitate. She told me she still had her own visit logs from those months, the ones she was required to keep for insurance purposes, dates and times of every visit, and notes. She always took notes on who was present each time she came. I drove home and went out to my garage, and I found the box marked Grandma. Keep still sitting exactly where I left it 8 months before, a little dustier, otherwise untouched. And I carried it inside, and I sat down at my kitchen table, and I opened it. And I took out that cracked white Bible and held it the way you hold something you suddenly understand. You should have opened a long time ago. I can tell you exactly how many times I saw Vanessa in that house in 6 months, she said, and it isn't a number that's going to surprise you. It wasn't. And then, finally, on a Saturday evening in early July, it still smelled like her. That's the part that undid me before I'd even gotten the cover open. That faint, particular smell of old paper and cashmere bouquet powder that had lived in that house for 60 years. For one disorienting second, I could have sworn I heard the creak of her rocking chair behind me. 2 beats and a pause, the way it always sounded when she was settling in to tell me something important. I sat there at my own kitchen table holding a book that smelled like my grandmother. And I let myself cry for the first time in months. Not because of anything I'd found yet, just because some part of me hadn't realized until that exact moment how much I had missed the particular sound of somebody saying my name like it mattered. I want to describe what I found inside it slowly, because that's how I found it. Slowly, one piece at a time. The way Grandma Ruth must have placed each piece there, one at a time, over the course of whatever quiet hours she'd had alone with that Bible in the months before she died. There was a letter first folded in thirds, tucked between the book of Ruth and the book of First Samuel, which I understood, reading it, she had chosen on purpose, her own name sitting right there at the start of the section she'd hidden her truth in. The letter was 4 pages, written in her careful, looping handwriting, the kind of handwriting that gets shakier toward the bottom of each page as her hand tired, but never once stopped being legible. Behind the letter were the receipts, my receipts, the very ones I kept in that manila envelope in my glove compartment, copies of them, because at some point I realized she must have asked me for them, told me she wanted to keep her own records, and I had given them to her without thinking twice, the way you do when somebody asks you for something small and you trust completely that they have their reasons. There was the receipt from a specialty pharmacy on Crawford Street, dated the second week of February, $41 for a medication her insurance wouldn't touch. There was a gas station receipt from the Shell station out on Highway 19, dated a Tuesday in March, $6 and some change. Because that was all the gas it took to drive from my house to hers and back, 4 times that particular week alone. There was a receipt for new nightgowns from the Belk in town, dated late March, the same week she'd gotten too thin for the one she already had. And I remembered buying those, standing in that aisle trying to guess a dying woman's size, without making her feel small for needing me to guess it. Behind the receipts were dated notes, a page for nearly every week of her decline, written in a kind of plain shorthand. February the 3rd. Lorraine, all day brought soup, washed my hair in the kitchen sink, didn't complain once, even though I know it hurt her back. February the 9th. Dr. Whitlow's office, 2 o'clock. Lorraine drove, sat through the whole appointment, asked the questions I forgot to ask. March the 14th. Lorraine again, every day this week. March the 22nd, Vanessa came by for an hour, brought roses, left before supper. I love her, but I see what I see. Weeks and weeks where my name appeared every single day, sometimes twice, and weeks where Vanessa's name appeared once, for an hour, with flowers, the dates getting further and further apart as the months wore on, exactly the way I remembered them being, except now there was a hand other than my own that had bothered to write all of it down. And behind all of it, the very last thing in the Bible, tucked against the back cover where the old grocery list had always lived, was a single bank statement, the church fund's own statement, copied and kept, showing exactly what had come in and exactly what had gone out, every line item dated and accounted for, the hospital bed rental, the in-home aid hours, the balance still sitting untouched at the bottom, matching dollar to dollar everything Mr. Coleman had already shown me. Behind the notes were thank you cards, ones I've forgotten I'd ever received, from church members thanking me for some small kindness during that time, cards Grandma must have asked to keep or quietly taken to keep because she understood somehow before any of the rest of us did that a day might come when proof would matter more than memory. What struck me most reading through all of it that night wasn't the money. It would be easy to think this is a story about dollars. It never really was, not for her and not in the end for me either. It was the soup. It was the hair washed in a kitchen sink because a salon chair had gotten too hard on her back. It was a hand held through a hallway that smelled like floor cleaner and a name said out loud, mine, written down in the dark, careful hand of a woman who could have spent her last good hours resting instead. Grandma Ruth hadn't spent the end of her life documenting dollars. She had spent it documenting love, the specific, unglamorous, 3 a.m. kind, because she understood long before any of the rest of us did that one day somebody might need proof that it had been real. Near the top of the second page of the letter, in handwriting that hadn't yet started to shake, she had written something I had never once been able to read without stopping. If you are reading this because people have begun doubting Lorraine, she wrote, then somebody chose whispers over 20 years of watching her love people. I watched her too, longer than anybody. I know which one deserves believing. She didn't write it like a warning. She wrote it like something she had simply always known. The way you know your own child's voice in a crowded room, plain and certain and not the least bit dramatic about it. I sat with that letter long after I finished reading it the first time, running my thumb along the places where her handwriting dipped and steadied again, where you could tell exactly which sentences had cost her more to write than others. The lamp over my kitchen table buzzed faintly, the same buzz I'd fallen asleep to 100 nights doing schoolwork as a girl. And somewhere outside a dog was barking at nothing. And inside that small, ordinary noise of my own kitchen, I was holding the last private conversation I would ever have with my grandmother, except this one, unlike all the others, I would never get to answer back. My grandmother had spent the last months of her life dying, in pain, frightened, in the particular way the dying get frightened, and she had still found the strength, somewhere in all of that, to quietly build an airtight case for her own granddaughter's innocence. Grandma knew. She had understood long before any of the rest of us exactly what kind of lie her other granddaughter was capable of telling, and exactly how much it would eventually cost me. I read that letter 3 times at night. I'm not going to tell you every word of it, because some things were meant only for me. But I will tell you the last line of it, because I have never once, in all the time since, been able to forget it. She wrote, I'm going to be there to defend you, baby, so I'm leaving the truth where it can defend you instead. Truth doesn't need defending the way people do. It just needs somebody brave enough to finally let it speak. The church's anniversary celebration was scheduled for the third Sunday in August. New Hope's 102nd year, a homecoming service that drew back members who moved away decades before, with the full choir, a guest preacher, a covered dish luncheon afterward, and the fellowship hall, the whole congregation dressed in their absolute Sunday best. It was also that particular year, the Sunday, the deacon board had chosen to publicly honor several members for their service to the church and somebody. I never did find out exactly who suggested it, though I have my suspicions, had put Vanessa's name on that list for her work with the youth choir and her years of volunteering with the Christmas pageant. I found out about it the same way everybody else did, from the program that got handed out at the door. I went to see Pastor Sims on the Thursday before, in his small office behind the sanctuary that still smelled the way it had smelled since I was 23 years old, like old hymnals and coffee, and the particular dust that settles in rooms full of books nobody moves very often. I didn't ask him to do anything dramatic. I want that understood clearly, because I think it would be easy to imagine this as some kind of plan for public revenge, and it wasn't that, not for me, and I don't believe it was what Grandma Ruth had intended either. I simply handed him the Bible and I told him what she'd asked me to do with it nearly a year before. And I told him I was sorry it had taken me this long to honor that request. And I let him decide, the way she'd trusted him to decide what to do with what was inside it. He read the letter while I sat across from him in that small office. I watched his face change while he read it, not dramatically. Pastor Sims wasn't a dramatic man, but there was a stillness that came over him about halfway down the first page that told me he understood exactly what he was holding. When he finished, he set the letter down on his desk very carefully, like it weighed more than 4 pages of paper should weigh, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. Sister Lorraine, he said, I am so sorry. I should have come to you the first week I heard a whisper of any of this. That's on me, and I'll carry that. You didn't know, I said. I should have asked, he said. That's the part I can't get past. 18 years of you in these pews, and not one person, including me, thought to simply ask you the truth before we let you stand outside of something this church should have been holding you up inside of something this church should have been holding you up inside of. He shook his head slowly. That's going to need its own kind of repenting, and it won't be quick. I asked him what he intended to do with the letter. He told me he intended to read it, the Sunday of the anniversary, to the whole church, in his own voice, exactly as Grandma Ruth had written it, because she'd asked for the truth to be allowed to speak. And a pastor's pulpit, he said, was exactly the kind of place truth was supposed to get to speak from. I asked him if he was going to say Vanessa's name out loud. No, he said, your grandmother didn't put her name in that letter, not once, not even when she had every right to. She let the truth do that work instead. I'm not going to do anything she didn't do herself. I didn't know yet how long that Sunday morning would end up living in my memory. I would replay nearly every minute of it for years. The anniversary service started the way it always had. Full choir, the deacons in their dark suits along the front. Pastor Sims' voice carrying that particular warmth he saved for homecoming Sundays, when half the congregation was made up of people who traveled hours to be there. Vanessa sat near the front with our parents, in a pale yellow dress that caught the light beautifully every time she turned her head. And when Pastor Sims called her name during the recognition portion of the service, she walked up with the particular grace she'd always had, and the whole congregation applauded warmly. That The way you applaud somebody you believe deserves it. And I clapped too, because some habits of love don't switch off just because you've learned the truth about somebody. And I think that's its own kind of sad thing to know about yourself. I sat near the back, which I'd taken to doing for months by then, in a pew that had once been the easiest seat in the church to find and was now simply the seat nobody minded my sitting in. After the recognitions, after the choir's final number before the sermon, Pastor Sims didn't go straight into his message the way he usually did. He stood at the pulpit for a moment, just looking out over the congregation, and then he reached down and picked up something I recognized immediately, even from the back of the sanctuary, a cracked white Bible gone the color of an old tooth that I had carried in a cardboard box for nearly a year without once understanding what I was carrying. Before I bring the word this morning, he said, I want to read you something else first. A letter from a woman a lot of you knew and loved for 60 years in this place. Sister Ruth Calloway wrote this letter near the end of her life, and she asked that it be shared with this congregation when the time was right. I believe with my whole heart that the time is right this morning. I want to tell you the sanctuary got quiet, but it had already been quiet. The particular hush of a homecoming Sunday settling in before a sermon. What I can tell you is that the quiet changed texture as he started reading. He read the part about February the 3rd, the suit, the hair washed in the kitchen sink. He read the part about Dr. Whitlow's office, the appointment where one granddaughter had sat through every question and the other hadn't been there to ask any of them. He read the gas station receipt, $6 and some change, and somebody in the third row let out a small sound, not quite a gasp, more like the sound a person makes when something heavy finally settles into place. He read the line about the nightgowns from Belk, and I watched two women near the front reach for each other's hands without either of them seeming to decide to do it. And then he read the line near the top of the second page. Slow the way you read something you don't want to rush past. If you are reading this because people have begun doubting Lorraine, Grandma Ruth had written, then somebody chose whispers over 20 years of watching her love people. Nobody in that sanctuary moved. I don't think anybody breathed. Not for a few seconds. It wasn't an accusation. It didn't need to be. It was simply the truest sentence anybody had said out loud in that building in 5 months. And I think every person in those pews understood exactly what it had cost my grandmother to write it, and exactly what it had cost my grandmother to write it, and exactly what it had cost me to wait this long to let it finally be heard. He read it slowly, the way Grandma Ruth would have wanted it read, not rushing towards some big reveal, but simply laying one true thing down after another, the way she had laid them down herself, one piece at a time in the quiet hours she'd had alone with that Bible. Every fact he read did its own small, patient work. Nobody needed him to explain what any of it meant. The receipts explained themselves. The dates explained themselves. The arithmetic, once it was finally spoken out loud in that sanctuary instead of whispered behind a half wall in the church kitchen, simply explained itself, the way truth tends to when it's finally given the room to. By the time he reached the part of the letter where she wrote out, plainly, boo, the exact total the church fund had brought in and the exact total it had been spent on, and noted, just as plainly, that every dollar matched and not 1 cent had ever gone missing. The entire congregation had already done, on their own, the small piece of arithmetic that connected every rumor they'd spent 5 months believing to the one sister who had actually never once been named in any of it, and the other sister who had. She never said Vanessa's name. Pastor Sims was right about that. She didn't need to. I watched my mother's face from across the sanctuary. I watched it understand in real time what she'd let happen to me with a single give everybody some space. I watched Vanessa too, though. I made myself look away after a moment because there are some things a person's face does that nobody else has the right to keep staring at, even somebody that face has wronged. Nobody gasped. Nobody pointed. The silence that had been sitting on me for 5 months simply changed direction. Slowly, the way weather changes, moving off of me and settling somewhere else. There was no triumph in it, not for me, not the way I imagine triumph is supposed to feel. There was only a long overdue kind of relief, quiet and tired, the relief of finally being allowed to set down something heavy I had been carrying along for almost a year. Truth didn't need a louder ending than the one it got that morning. It just needed somewhere to finally land. In the weeks after that Sunday, nobody organized any kind of formal apology. There wasn't a meeting. There wasn't a vote. Nobody stood up the following week and announced that the church had been wrong. That isn't how these things tend to go, in my experience, in places like New Hope. What happened instead was smaller and slower and in its own way more honest than any formal apology could have been. Geraldine Holt asked quietly this, but after service one Sunday, if I'd forgive her for not asking me directly all those months ago. instead of just believing what she'd heard. And I told her yes, because I decided somewhere in that long, quiet season that holding on to my anger wasn't a job I wanted for the rest of my life, even toward people who had earned a good amount of it. Earline Watts hugged me at the door the very next Sunday, the same close talcum and lavender hug she'd given me every week for 18 years before that one cold Sunday, 8 months earlier. And she didn't say anything about any of it, and I didn't make her. And that hug said more than any words either of us could have found. I should have asked you straight out instead of telling you to give people space, and that was as close to a full accounting as she ever gave me. And I have made my peace with it being that close and no closer, because some people only have a certain amount of looking at themselves in them. And 43 years had taught me not to keep waiting on more than a person actually has. My benevolence committee seat came back to me without anybody mentioning that it had ever left. My parents were harder, and I want to be honest about that too, because not every part of a story like this gets a neat ending. My mother called me about a week after the anniversary service and said simply, I should have asked you, baby. Manessa didn't call at all. I heard secondhand, the way you hear most things in a small church family, that she'd stopped attending New Hope altogether within a month, that she'd started going to a church 2 towns over, one where nobody had been sitting in those pews back when Grandma Ruth's letter got read out loud. I don't know if she's ever told anybody there what happened. I don't know if she's ever once said my name with anything close to the truth attached to it. I think about her sometimes more gently than I expected I would, because I genuinely believe in Grandma Ruth. I think believe this too underneath everything she wrote, that Vanessa never set out at the start to be a person who'd do something like this. I think somewhere over 30 years of being caught every time she fell, she simply never learned what it costs another person to be the one who doesn't get caught. It was a Sunday in October, 2 months after the anniversary service, when Keisha, the little girl who used to hug my legs every week before her mother started turning her shoulders away, broke loose from her mother's hand in the church foyer and straight at me, full speed, the way 7-year-olds run when nobody's told them yet to slow down for the sake of dignity, and wrapped both arms around my waist before I'd even fully registered she was coming. I don't know if that makes what she did forgivable. I've decided it isn't really my job to decide that. I've just decided it isn't going to be the thing I carry around for the rest of my life either. I don't know if her mother had explained anything to her. I don't know if Keisha had simply decided on her own in the small, clear way children sometimes decide things, that whatever had kept her away from me for those months wasn't true anymore and never needed explaining in the first place. I didn't ask. I just put my hand on the back of her head the way I'd done 100 times before all of this started and let her hug last exactly as long as she needed it to. She smelled like grape juice in the inside of a church van, and her hair was still damp at the temples from running, as somewhere behind us, the choir was warming up for the next service, somebody hitting the same note over and over until it finally sat right. I remember every one of those small, unremarkable details with a clarity I don't have for plenty of bigger moments in my life, because I think some part of me already understood, holding on to that child in that foyer, that I was going to want to remember exactly how that morning smelled and sounded for a long time to come. That one hug. From a 7-year-old who didn't owe me an apology and didn't try to give me one because she never understood there was anything to apologize for, meant more to me than every careful, half-finished conversation I'd had with the grown adults in my life over the months before it. It wasn't my reputation I felt come back to me in that hug. My reputation had already been returned to me weeks before, in a sanctuary full of receipts and dates. What came back to me in that small, fierce hug was something quieter and harder to name. My place. The plain, unremarkable right to belong somewhere without having to prove it first. I kept Grandma Ruth's Bible after that. Pastor Sam's offered to keep it in the church office as a kind of record, but I asked if I could have it back, and he understood, and he handed it over without argument. It sits on my own nightstand now in the same spot it used to sit on hers, cracked white leather and all, and some nights when the house is quiet, I take it down and hold it the way she used to hold it, and I read that last line of her letter again, even though I know it by heart, because there are some sentences worth reading in somebody's own handwriting instead of just in your memory of it. I won't be there to defend you, baby, so I'm leaving the truth where it can defend you instead. Truth doesn't need defending the way people do. It just needs somebody brave enough to finally let it speak. I think about that a lot now. I think about how a lie can travel through a church full of people who love you in just a matter of weeks, quiet and fast. Like water finding every crack in a foundation you thought was solid. And I think about how long the truth took to catch up to it, almost a year. In my case, hidden behind the book of Ruth and an old woman's Bible, waiting patiently for somebody brave enough, or maybe just ready enough to finally let it speak. Some lies can steal your reputation. I know that now in a way I didn't before any of this happened. But I also know in a way I think I'll care for the rest of my life that only the truth can ever actually give your name back to you, clean and whole, the way it was before anybody ever thought to take it. That's all the ending I have, no big celebration, no moment where everybody who wronged me lined up to make it right. Just a hug from a little girl who never stopped trusting me, an old Bible on my nightstand, and a quiet kind of peace that took its time arriving, but when it finally did, it stayed.